Hello everyone, today I'm going to present you my podcast, and my theme for the podcast was ontological security and what threats does European Union have nowadays and its impact on the identities of citizens in different countries. I found a really interesting researcher, Oliver Merschel, and I'm really thankful for him that he gave me a really nice interview together. And he is a specialist on the topic of the security, and his work for PhD was also connected to Brexit and its ontological security impact on the European Union. So we had a really nice conversation together. I hope that you enjoyed. And ontological security for me was interesting topic because by this theme we can not only describe ontological security on individual level, but also make focus on states or organization itself. And for me, it was especially interesting how do European Union and states in the organization feel secure on the ontological level nowadays. Do they had some threats, or maybe in some cases they did not feel so secure in the later perspective, and what caused it? For me, ontological security was not only like philosophy, but also I took it from the psychological point of view. And I think that ontological security is a really interesting perspective because we have a lot of different threats, but not always we consider ontological threats as the main factor of some reasons. So I tried to figure it out with my podcast and with my researcher. And of course, I wish you good watching my podcast, and I hope that you will enjoy it. So now I'd like to pass to some information and discussion about ontological security in case of European Union and other organization that can be also working on ontological security phase. And before our discussion, I've read some publications and research, and especially I like the Jennifer Metzen one about European Union, and she described it like homeland and home space for some people that European Union nowadays we can see for some migration and refugees. And from that, I have a question. From a more psychological point of view, how can we describe this desire of states to create communities and unions, such as European Union, for example, and cooperate from the ontological sense of security? So, what can you say?
If you look at Metzen's work, for example, you can certainly interpret the European Union as a space where ontological security is sought for. So those routines, those interactions between member states that she talks about, that always happen again and again, and it becomes predictable, and you know each other very well, see each other often, and so on, cooperate, yes. That might bring you some sense of ontological security. And it's an interesting perspective to interpret it in that way. But I don't know if I would say that, like you said, that states, for example, choose integration because of ontological security. So to say that there's a causal connection there, that would be very difficult to say. So of course, mainly if you look, like you also said, at the classic reasons for integration, it's economic reasons, and it's also in the very beginning to stop physical violence and war from emerging again in Western Europe. So that were the classic reasons for doing it, and it was to some extent against the usual self-identities of many states who were, in the centuries before, not really having narratives of cooperation but more of conflict, like Germany and among each other. So I think immediately it was more of, if you want to use that term, like a leap of faith forward. So not that you feel really secure by doing it, but you really have to take that risk and try integration, because there are other economics and practical reasons and peace reasons, so to say, very good reasons for it. And in the long term, of course, when you are part of a routinized community, then you also gain a lot of ontological security for it. But in the moment of integration of the European Union being created, I think it was more of an anxious moment, really, because there was no clear way of knowing how it would work, where it would lead. It was something new, so I would not immediately make the causal relation as far as the emergence of integration goes, but now that the European Union is there, it does make sense to interpret it in the sense of what ontological security as Mitzen does.
Okay, I can see right now your point of view, but for example, talking about of post-Soviet Union countries, post-Soviet bloc countries like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on. Don't you think that they were also seeking for this feeling of secure even after this Soviet Union collapse? They wanted to gain something more and to reach something more, so they choose other way to European Union and to NATO because of it. Don't you feel that it's also connected to this ontological security, because people don't feel secure, didn't feel secure in the time and in the period of their history?
So you mean that it's also a reason to join, for example, the EU for post-Soviet countries to be part of a community of values, of a narrative also?
Yes, I mean that the stability which they can gain with European Union and NATO is something that they were really seeking for, not only from the economical point of view, but also for this feeling of secure, that people want to have stability and be sure in something.
I agree with that. But of course, if you look at a theory like ontological security, that is very abstract to some extent, and then at a very complex situation, like the development of post-Soviet countries after the end of the Cold War, there are so many factors that led to the developments that happened. So there is not one single point in time where somebody decides, of course, that you are going to now join the Western community because that really helps your ontological security or something like that. So there are so many things, economic, also psychological, plays into that, yeah. So, but I would be careful with like a strong statement of why something happened that is such a complex and long-term historical development because of ontological security. But again, it can still be a useful lens to apply ontological security to that and work out in detail this dimension as well of maybe being in the situation of uncertainty after the end of the Cold War between East and West, looking for a narrative vision of the future that you can join to, that you can gain more connections to, and so on. Yeah, absolutely. You can make that argument, but as long as it increases the complexity along with other factors, not decrease the complexity of your argument and leave out economic and practical reasons and reasons of peace and war and just pure chance as well. So that would be my view on it.
So, if understood correctly, to make some conclusion, we cannot just only focus on ontological security in this case, but also its economical and political reasons. But still, we can find some reasons for that in ontological for prospective ontological security.
I think there you can see it as one dimension, as it were, ontological security, and I think that's productive and it adds something. But we shouldn't have to choose between looking at the ontological security dimensions and clearly also other dimensions that play a role there, and it should be like a simplifying narrative or so of ontological security now. That's the grand theory that suddenly explains history. So So as long as we are careful to do that, it's useful to add that perspectives to all the complex history, for example, of Eastern Europe after the Cold War that we already know.
Yeah, so now I'd like to pass to another question of mine, and it was about the main threats that ontological security has, for example, nowadays, and that makes citizens or states afraid of the further integration of the European Union. So, as I also read about a lot, that we in ontological security, in some case, we know the borders of the European Union, but still it's not clear, and it's a little bit even blurred about the borders of the Europe. So still it can be even like in other countries which is far away from the European Union borders, and they wanted to be the part of the European Union in the future. So how do you think, is there any threats from this point of view, that maybe citizens afraid to have more and bigger community from the other citizen of other countries? And another question, besides the economical factor, will it affect on ontological security?
I'm not sure if they are afraid in that sense. Of course, there are always reasons to be in favor or against certain states joining. I think that has always been the case. And that has sometimes to do with domestic policies in the country. I mean, if you look at a country like Austria, and why they sometimes object to more people joining the Schengen area and so on, it has clearly reasons. You know, they have a strong right populist party, which is now, I think, the leading party in the polls in Austria, and they want to please those voters. It's pure, simple, sometimes the reasons for that. So I don't know if I can say what are the main threats. I mean, it depends actually on each state that could be joining, of course. I think as far as maybe to take the prominent example Ukraine goes, I mean, from an ontological security perspective, I think it would be, for the self-understanding of the EU, it would be good if they join. Because clearly, so to say, it's a mission, the European Union supports Ukraine and the values they are upholding in the war, and it would only make the European Union's narrative of supporting Ukraine stronger if they were in. But for practical reasons, because of physical threats actually from Russia's war, it's not possible for them to join at this moment. So it's maybe also shows that it's not can be from an ontological security perspective make even sense that states join, but practically it doesn't work. So you have to find your way sometimes awkwardly of explaining why states can't join yet. So I'm not really an expert on each member, on each candidate for joining, but I don't know if you would be interested in specific ones. And as far as citizens' perceptions of enlargement, I think that varies extremely. I mean, for each member state, you could ask the opinion of citizens for each potential candidate. With Germany and Turkey, you have had, on the one hand, a really close relation, for example, between the two countries, which would make, so to say, it explains why Germany has supported for a long time in the past them joining. But on the other hand, of course, since the development in the last decade or so with its autocratic tendencies, it has meant that it's not at all realistic anymore that Turkey would join. So, so I don't really have specific expertise in that on specific member state candidates in that sense. But if you can, zoom in on a specific area you're interested in, then maybe we can try to speculate a little bit about that if you like.
Yeah, so in that case, I would probably mention the Hungary policy nowadays, especially since the Russian Ukrainian war started. Maybe we should say, or how do you think about it, that Hungary policy is pretty controversial of or against European Union policy, and it's all about resolution and sanctions and so on. So, how do you think is it make a sense of security less in the European Union, and is it somehow make shakeable position for the citizen of the EU and their attitude toward this policy in Hungary and for other states and members of the EU, European Union? I mean, so what do you think? And maybe you can have some comment.
To some extent, as a member state, you cannot decide your own policy, right? Because European law has to be obeyed. Yeah, so you cannot just say, okay, we don't like the European law if you are in the Union. Of course, if as long as it's within what is allowed by European law, you can show us policies as you like. But of course, as you know, in the case of Hungary, it has often been, or at least sometimes been the case, that they did not comply with European law, and that's of course something that may also cause a threat to the ontological security of the European Union. If you think like in the rule of law context and so on, that you have member states that are not upholding the values that you identify as connecting for the whole community, really. So I would be, of course, open to make clear that you cannot just choose any law when you are a member state. But within that scope, of course, you may still or may not do laws that people might like or not in your state. So I'm not an expert on what precisely are the opinion polls in Hungarian society. Obviously, there has been a lot of discontent, I think it's safe to say, with Orban's government. There are, of course, on the other hand, although we know that, like the last elections have also been problematic to some extent, how they were carried out, but there are also still a lot of people who support him. So I think there's a lot of polarization there in the society, but that's really more my impression from reading some media reports and so on than anything scientific. But what could be interesting is that for those groups of people within Hungarian society that are indeed active against, so to say, Orban's government, I think there is often a strong identification with the European Union and with an ontological security level that you may like see that your own values do not match up with what your country is doing, but they do find, so to say, a home or a connection to the European level in those values. So I'm not sure if it was correct, but what I once saw a map of how strong is the identification with your home state or with your region or with the European Union as such. And if you look, for example, at Hungary, there was one space, which is Budapest, where the identification was maybe the strongest from all of Europe with the European Union and not with Hungary. So I think that tells you something of how much you can also find some form of identification in ontological security from the European Union.
Yeah, I can see it now. Thank you. And we should pass to another question of mine, which I have, and it's more like from the possible threats that globalization face nowadays. How do you think do ontological security has threats now? Could we count, for example, like globalization or migration problems or refugees problems and the fact that make ontological security unstable?
Yeah, so I think like with any theory in principle, you could apply to anything. So like if you like the saying goes, if you walk around with a hammer, anything will look like a nail. So you could always apply ontological security, and it makes sense often. But you have to be careful also, not just to look for ontological security problems or anxieties always just because that is your theory. So, like you said, of course, it has been applied to context of globalization, by Kinwall also, and to migration, to borders, to populism. It has been applied, I think, successfully. Found it interesting what you said earlier about autocratic and democratic societies. I don't know how much that has been explored there, the ontological security dimension, but that would be another interesting aspect as well. For my own personal research, I found that ontological security was often applied on the individual level or really abstract on the level of a whole state or a whole society. So, do we live in an age of anxiety? Is a state ontologically secure, or specific individuals psychologically? And I find it interesting to apply it in between of that. So to say, on the intermediate level between neither the whole EU nor just a person. So, for example, what I do in my work is try to investigate how it actually looks like within the EU. So people who work in the EU, not like a high-level politician, but civil servants, bureaucrats, diplomats, and so on, how they are able to cope with multiple crises and uncertainties in their everyday work, and to investigate on that intermediate level of political decision-making and policy-making and administration ontological security. So I do find it useful to apply it to specific context, not just to abstract discourses only or abstract narratives only. Although that can also have merit in itself, but I really find it more helpful to be very specific in the context of specific persons who may be able to cope with ontological insecurity or not. But also, of course, not just on the psychology of individuals, because that's not my field, but in context of political institutions and so on, where multiple people interact in a context and shape a policy or institution together. That in general, I think, is an interesting area for application of ontological security that hasn't so much been pursued yet. But of course, those topics that have been done so far, like migration, globalization, and so populism, will certainly continue to matter a lot.
Yes, I agree. It's totally a big part of discussion. And still, I wanted to mention another threat that I mean. It's a Russian-Ukrainian war. It's really actual now. And still, can we say that it's a threat for ontological security? And is it has somehow badly affect on the European Union states in the sense of insecurity?
Yeah, you certainly can apply ontological security there as well. I mean, it really depends on the state itself. I mean, for some states, probably more, especially those states in Eastern Europe who have been warning against Russia for decades, but nobody really listened in Western Europe. So for them, it's probably more of a confirmation of the narratives they already had. So you feel physically insecure because now it has become more realistic to be attacked by Russia. But ontologically, you know what your position is. You have been right, so to say, such as the Baltic states and Poland warning against Russia. So there's not really an ontological security problem there. It may be different for states like Germany, who have been in close cooperation with Russia and had expected a different development, obviously, than what happened. Then you have to some extent readjust your narratives. So that can also work to some extent. So just because one narrative has failed, like I think I don't know if there's a specific English term, but like the German Wandel durch Handel, so to change something in Russia by doing economic cooperation and trade with them, was a really strong narrative, has obviously failed. But it has also been possible to readjust that narrative and find a new position, not without problems, not not without conflicts, not without uncertainties. But although it was a challenge, it is possible to readjust a narrative. Not just because one narrative fails or a shock happens, doesn't mean that you will enter a crisis of ontological insecurity automatically. So I don't think that any country has really entered like a crisis state of ontological insecurity because of the war against Ukraine. But of course, there have been problems in adjusting the narrative, which especially if it had been more optimistic about Russia in the past. But I think all in all, a narrative has been found of supporting Ukraine, of upholding democratic European values, and so on. And that, as such, is not really a problem for ontological security in the first instance. Although there are, of course, many practical problems, conflicts about what exactly should be done, who should pay for what should happen next, and so on. There are many problems, of course. But I don't think there has been like a crisis of ontological insecurity spreading throughout the EU because of the war against Ukraine. Of course, the immediate shock on the day of the invasion, sure, but that always happens when you have such a shock. That doesn't really tell you a lot about ontological security as such. What is interesting is in the long term if you are able to cope with the shock or not. And I think on the ontological level, mostly Europe has been able to cope so far.
Yeah, well, should I pass now for another question which I have? And it's about such term as challenge of identity. I have read also some information about it, and it basically connected with ontological security because still on the individual level, the person can feel insecure in the state, and it also connected with some kind of globalization because we became much blurred about some borders. And how can it the sense of ontological security provoke this challenge of identity?
In my understanding of ontological security, it's not the same as identity. So just because your identity changes to some extent doesn't mean that you have a problem with ontological security. For me, ontological security more means you are able to cope with fundamental uncertainties and anxieties that are part of the human experience, and identities may help you to cope with that. And there can be cases when an identity is challenged and it leads to ontological insecurity, but it's not the same thing. So if you have a stable identity and you always just stick to that identity no matter what happens, that can actually lead you to a path of ontological insecurity because you are so blind to what is happening, you are starting to fear everything that is different from your identity, that can lead you on a very much a path of anxiety. So really, I think a certain flexibility of identity, although not exactly the same as ontological security, is more helpful to cope with uncertainties, anxieties, insecurities. So challenges to ontological security mostly happen when you are no longer feeling, so to say, in control, or feeling that you have a basic compass for your actions, that you have sort of answers on a fundamental level of what you should do. So challenges of identity can lead there, but don't have to. So I don't specifically focus in my research on challenges of identity, but maybe still to give an example from my research on the EU, where I also sometimes focus on Brexit and what effect Brexit has had on the EU. So of course there has been a certain narrative established in the EU that also helped to cope with uncertainties and be ontologically secure, which was that there's in the end always more integration. It can be difficult, it takes ages, can be too slow and whatever, but you are slowly in a story of progress, where you will have slowly more and more states joining, closer and closer cooperation over time. And it was not planned in that narrative to have a state leaving. And of course, especially not a state that was as influential and large as the UK. So that really didn't fit the self-image of the EU up until that point. And that, of course, could have led and maybe did lead initially to a shock and could have led in the longer term to ontological insecurity if the EU had been unable to readjust their identity and say, we are only know who we are and what is important if we are always a story of progress and never somebody leaves. That could have led to like a paralyzing state, to a crisis, but that didn't happen, in my opinion at least. So to some extent, the remaining EU 27 have been able to rearrange their position actually quite quickly and find a position in the negotiations with the UK and even take to some extent a positive impulse from that and saying, okay, it's not good that Brexit is happening, but we will be able to cope, we will be able to find a position vis-a-vis the UK, and we will be able to move forward maybe even more enthusiastically in the integration within the remaining EU 27. So a change of identity is possible, and when your identity does not really fit to a shock that happens, that is a crisis situation, yes, but that doesn't mean that ontological insecurity will emerge. You can find ways to readjust your identity to cope with that new uncertainty. So a challenge to the identity doesn't have to mean ontological insecurity.
Yeah, I can see your point right now about Brexit, and maybe you can tell me some more information about how this Brexit happened and how did it affect on the British people, their citizens, when the government was suddenly out of the organization where they were a pretty long time cooperated with other one and work with them on different ontologically security. Do they feel insecure after they went out, or even more secure than rather usually they did?
So you mean the British citizens, or so maybe I would have to recheck that, but I think I just saw that a poll came out that for the first time a majority of UK citizens would actually be in favor of rejoining the EU even. So I think it all varies among different parts of British society, of course. And the rejoining is not really on the table right now. But all in all, I think they have not been happy. So that has been, of course, really also made it easier for the EU to cope with Brexit, because it has become clear quite quickly, both economically and politically, that it led to huge instabilities in the UK. So there has not been really a success story, even for the people who were in favor of leaving. So I mean, as a most extreme example, all those shortages of some specific kinds of food and goods in the UK sometimes because of economic difficulties and problems with delivery and so on. So then on top of that, the political instabilities, which have been tragic even, that you would like to laugh about, but you can't anymore, with something like having 3 prime ministers in the course of a few months and so on. That is all connected to Brexit, and especially, of course, to the members of the House of Commons, to that specific fraction that are very extremely for Brexit and for hard Brexit and so on. And they always cause conflicts within the Conservative Party. So all of that, of course, you will find people who are happy with Brexit, but all in all, I think it has been more of a failure. And from an ontological security perspective, as I also mentioned, maybe to be more specific, there's an article by Christopher Browning there on Brexit and fantasies of fulfillment, where he argues that although initially for people who voted to leave, that was of course like a confirmation of their narrative, and they felt happy about it, about Brexit, but in the long run, it didn't really fulfill their fantasies. So what you always have in those narratives of why the UK should leave was that when you finally leave, it will all be good, it's all going to work, we are going to be strong Great Britain again and whatever. And that can never really be fulfilled. So So you always have to say, now Theresa May at the time is preventing a hard Brexit, that's a problem. Or now the EU is preventing a real Brexit. So you always find a new scapegoat why Brexit is not really bringing you the fulfillment of those fantasies of a huge, great Britain again. So even for those people who won the vote, so to say, even for them, I think Brexit is not only a good thing, but also a challenge for their ontological security, because they connected their ontological security to that narrative of finally everything will get better after Brexit, and that is always indefinitely postponed in the future, that everything gets better. So that actually can lead to a sense of anxiety as well. But of course, you will also find some people who are just in love with Brexit and think everything is great now. But if you look both at polls, opinion polls, economic data, and also probably actually at the opinions of many people who voted to leave, I think many people are unhappy and probably less secure. And of course, for people who were against Brexit, and especially who were specifically discriminated against then in that context, like migrants or people with several citizenships and so on, there is absolutely clear that it's only that it has only been negative.
All right, and thank you for your open answer on the ontological security prospect and the Brexit theme. Also, I wanted to ask you, for example, if we took that in the future, one of the European country would choose the way of the Great Britain and would choose to leave the European Union, how will it affect on the citizen and their attitude toward the European Union? How the states would react? Won't it be so shakable? And would it lead this organization to a really bad path, or even I don't know, negative position in the eyes of the future prospect?
I do think, yeah. I mean, if a member state really leaves, it leads at least to a situation of uncertainty immediately. And yeah, in the days after Brexit, before everything had moved to that stability that we see now, there had been that fear of a chain reaction. And that was indeed, I think, at least a moment of ontological insecurity for the EU, that you didn't know how much that would happen again, or if it could happen in a chain reaction. And also, of course, that it has become thinkable that member states leave, has, I think, left to some extent an imprint in the everyday works of the EU. It's not a constant fear, it's not really present, you don't see any ontological insecurity because of that, but in the background, of course, it has become thinkable, and that can still be a challenge. To go specifically to your question, I don't see any member state close to leaving right now. But if it would happen in the future, which could happen, it would be a challenge in the first instance. But depending on who it is, I do not think that it would lead to a destruction of the Union. So Hungary, I think they gain the most, or Orban gains the most if he stays in, but leads to conflicts within. So leaving would be very costly for Hungary, even though they seem to be always in conflict with the Union. Still, I think economically it's much better than if they left, and it would be strategically also very not smart for Orban to leave, I think, for his own position. But of course it's not impossible. Then certainly Hungary would be, if they left, would probably be, because of the conflicts that had already happened, would probably be less of a death blow for the Union than if France left. So, right? That's like so. There had been a point in time where Marine Le Pen and so on campaigned for the Frexit, as it were, for France leaving the EU. That's like if one of those core member states would leave, in reality, that could probably destroy the Union. But I don't see that happening at all, and I don't think the fear of that is present at all. I mean, at least, I think even a most of the EU really, especially in Western Europe, even right-wing populists have stopped campaigning for leaving the EU. They campaign with all kinds of insults and criticism of the EU, but they know that there isn't really a great election to win by campaigning for leaving, especially after how Brexit actually turned out as a rather unsuccessful story for the UK, as we discussed. So if they don't even campaign for it, it's not going to happen, especially. Like, even if you campaign for leaving, it's far from clear if you can actually go through with it when elected, because there are still so many factors that influence you when you are in office, and the EU will try to stop it and so on. So I absolutely do not see a member state leaving that could threaten the EU as such. I find it unlikely that another member state would leave, like Hungary. Still find it unlikely, not impossible, but I don't think that would destroy the Union. And I don't feel like, in the moment at least, it's not really present in the everyday work of the EU anymore. It's not fully gone, it has become thinkable, but it's not, of all the crises that you face, it's not a high on the agenda. It's not likely to.
So, as a conclusion, I can say that we figure out pretty interesting topics, also for the maybe future some researchers. Of course, we focused ourselves on the different European countries, and we took a lot of examples for providing this information, that even though European Union is a big organization and many countries in it, still states have its own policy and its own government independence on this special level, which European Union cannot always influence on. And for example, if the state in the European Union, but still it does not appreciate the values which European Union have, is like democratization, liberalization, and other perspective, then we can say that this state can be as ontological threat for the organization, because it also can, for example, make a push or another platform for another countries to behave the same way. Also, we mentioned a lot of different problems like Russian-Ukrainian war, Brexit, and also policy of special countries. And I found it's like really important issues for the level of ontological security, and like for society, and like for state, and like for organization. So as conclusion, it's always important to have not only physical security for states, but also ontological security, and the same way it works for state organization. And I think that still my project may be conducted by some surveys, and maybe even have more and bigger way for development, because we found really interesting topics during our interview and during my podcast. So thank you for your attention, and I hope that you enjoyed it.